They thought it was a photograph, but it was a confession in plain sight. The father sat rigid in the center of the frame, his sons standing solemnly at either side, their shadows touching but their eyes refusing to meet. And if anyone had cared to look closely, closer than comfort allowed, they would have seen the hands. Always the hands. Before we continue, take a breath. The past is closer than you think. Subscribe to remember what others forgot. The house where the portrait was taken no longer stands. Its beams rotted, its roof sank inward, and the wind eventually carried its ashes across the valley. But long before the fire, before the decay, before the rumors curdled into folklore, it was known simply as Merrick House. A place where silence lived longer than people and where the walls listened harder than they supported. It was built in 1842 by Elias Merrick, a watchmaker whose devotion to precision seeped into every element of his life. He believed time was a creature that could be tamed, provided one held still long enough to watch it breathe. And so he built his house carefully, deliberately, room by room, as if constructing a trap for the years themselves. His sons, Daniel and Corin, grew under that same stillness. They were born 12 minutes apart, identical in face but not in soul. Daniel had the eyes of someone who sought the edges of things, who pushed on closed doors, who pressed his ear against secrets to hear what trembled behind them. Corin, by contrast, was quieter, observant in a manner that felt more like endurance than curiosity, as though life were a weight he had been assigned to carry with no instructions on how to set it down. Together, they formed the strange symmetry of a family that never quite breathed at the same rhythm. The portrait was taken in late autumn, when the fog settled so low that it brushed the porch steps each morning. A photographer from the next county, a man with a limp and a lens he claimed could capture truth rather than likeness, arrived with his equipment strapped to a mule. He studied the Merricks for a long moment before arranging them, moving them into place with a precision Elias appreciated. The father sat, the sons stood. But the photographer frowned as though some invisible line needed tightening. He guided the father's hands into a shape, fingers interlocked in a strange, deliberate fold, then placed the sons' hands gently on their father's shoulders, their fingers angled toward that symbol like accusations frozen in time. Daniel flinched at the touch, though no one mentioned it. Corin stared at the horizon behind the photographer's head as though trying to see beyond the moment entirely. Elias remained motionless. The shutter clicked. What the photograph captured was not a family but an arrangement. After the portrait was taken, the photographer packed his plates with an urgency that made even Elias narrow his eyes. The man did not stay for supper, nor did he accept payment beyond a single coin. He left before the sun dipped, limping quickly, looking over his shoulder more than once as though he feared he had taken something he should not have touched. Life at Merrick House resumed its quiet shape, though Daniel felt something shift the moment the shutter snapped. A heaviness entered the halls. A draft seemed to follow him from room to room. Doors he knew he had closed were open when he returned. The grandfather clock that had not chimed in years began to mark the hours again, softly, like breathing. Corin said nothing of these things, but his silence deepened. He spent more time in the attic, where the dust fell in beams like suspended snowfall. Elias worked in his workshop with a fervor that bordered on frantic, though the clocks he crafted in those days never worked properly. Their hands spun endlessly, uncontrolled, as if mocking the very idea of order. Visitors noticed the change too. They said the Merricks looked paler, thinner, as though the portrait had stolen something essential from them. Some swore they heard whispers behind the walls. Others claimed the windows reflected faces not present in the room. Nobody stayed long. Daniel, increasingly unsettled, returned often to the parlor where the portrait hung. At first he examined it because he could not shake the feeling that something in it had been wrong from the beginning. Later he returned because he feared the painting was changing. He would stare at it for hours, tracing the lines of their poses, searching for signs of distortion. The father's folded hands, had they always seemed so strained, tendons taut as if resisting? The son's pointing fingers, did they always angle so sharply, like accusations sharpened over time? He could not be sure. One night, after a storm that left the river swollen and the roads thick with mud, Daniel found Corin standing before the portrait at an hour when the house was usually silent. The candles burned low, their trembling flames casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like reaching arms. Corin did not turn when Daniel entered. Instead he spoke softly, as if afraid the house itself was listening. "Do you ever wonder," he murmured, "why he made us stand like that?" Daniel swallowed. "The photographer arranged us." "No," Corin whispered. "Father allowed it." Something in his voice made Daniel step closer. The air felt colder here, as though the portrait exhaled frost. Corin's eyes were fixed on their father's folded hands. He knew what that shape meant, Corin said. I saw it once before. In his workshop. He hid it under the clock plates. Daniel felt his pulse rise. What does it mean? Corin finally looked at him, and the expression he wore was not fear but grief. It's a binding, he said. For secrets that cannot be spoken. Daniel's throat tightened. Whose secrets? Corin's gaze drifted back to the portrait. Ours? The candles shivered though no wind moved through the room. For a moment, the house seemed to inhale. Daniel heard the faintest sound, like gears turning, like time shifting its weight. Elias stood in the doorway. Neither son had heard him approach. He looked at them not with anger but with something far heavier. You boys, he said quietly, should not be awake. Corin lowered his eyes immediately. Daniel did not. Elias stepped forward, his shadow falling across the portrait like a closing curtain. Some truths, he murmured, are not meant to be touched. Daniel's breath caught. Then why put them in a photograph? Elias did not answer. Behind him, the grandfather clock began to chime. The hands on the portrait seemed, just for a heartbeat, to shift. And somewhere deep within the house, something unseen stirred. The deeper one looked into the Marin family's past, the more the air around their estate seemed to thicken. The house had stood for nearly 2 centuries, a sprawling stone structure perched on a sloping hill that overlooked a dying village. Most locals refused to go near it. Those who dared never crossed the front gate twice. For generations, the Marins had kept to themselves, raising children in pairs, producing twin after twin with eerie consistency, as if the bloodline had been engineered for one purpose alone. Rumors had always circulated, but no one outside the family ever confirmed them. No one dared to. What was known came only from whispers, strange rituals, an obsession with symmetry, and nights when lights flickered behind the highest windows long after midnight. James Marin was the youngest of his generation, a quiet boy with steady eyes and the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of watching rather than speaking. His twin sister, Leora, mirrored him in every physical way yet lived as though she carried a secret too heavy for her slender frame. Most visitors assumed they were close because twins often were. What they didn't see were the silent dinners, the interrupted words, and the way Leora's hand always trembled right before their father entered the room. No one saw how James counted her breaths whenever she woke from nightmares. No one saw what she wrote in the torn pages she hid beneath the floorboards. The Marin patriarch, Alastair, presided over the household with discipline masked as tradition. He spoke of legacy, of duty, and of the honor that came from preserving the family's design. Every pair of twins before James and Leora had followed this design. Sons tied their lives to their twin sisters in a ritual called the binding, a ceremony older than the house itself. It was the Marin's way, he always said. The only way. And every eldest boy accepted it. Every youngest boy obeyed it. Generations of secrecy ensured that no one outside the estate ever understood the full meaning of the binding. Those who questioned the tradition were swiftly corrected. Those who resisted disappeared from family memory altogether. As the day of James and Leora's binding approached, tension seeped into every hallway. Servants exchanged anxious glances and refused to linger in rooms where Alastair's shadow fell. Even the air inside the house seemed to listen, waiting for something to unravel. Leora grew quieter with each passing sunrise, though her eyes carried more urgency than fear. James noticed everything, the subtle way she avoided their father, the way she flinched when their names were spoken together, the way her breath shook at the mention of tradition. He did not understand the cause, but he felt the weight of something pressing against them, something old and unspoken. One evening, Leora slipped into James's room without knocking. Her hair was damp with cold night air, and her fingers grasped a folded paper so tightly the edges had curled. She locked the door behind her, a gesture she had never made before. When she spoke, her voice cracked as though unused for days. She told James that he needed to listen without interrupting. The paper in her hand was part of a journal, not hers but their Uncle Rowan's. Rowan had been the last Marin son who refused the binding. The family claimed he died of illness. The journal said otherwise. James listened as Leora read the words in a trembling whisper. Rowan had discovered the truth about the binding, the reason twins were forced into ritual pairing. The Marin family believed twins were born with shared spiritual essence, and the binding was designed to merge those halves permanently. But the process was never symbolic. It demanded obedience, control, and most horrifyingly, the sacrifice of the twin deemed weaker by the family elders. Rowan wrote that the binding wasn't just a ceremony. It was a ritual designed to extract life from one twin so the other could be shaped into the perfect heir. Rowan refused. Rowan tried to run. And Rowan paid the price. James felt the world tilt as Leora finished reading. The room, once familiar, seemed to tighten around them. The house creaked under their feet as if eavesdropping. He remembered their father's words about duty and tradition. He remembered the odd number of unmarked graves in the family's private cemetery. He remembered how none of the older twins ever spoke of their ceremonies. The pieces fit together too perfectly. The truth scratched at his mind with cold fingers. As Leora folded the page again, her eyes filled with a desperate clarity he had never seen before. She confessed she had known for months. She had overheard their father speaking to the elders late one night. She had heard her own name spoken as the offering. She hadn't known how to tell James. She feared he would follow the family as every son before him had done. She feared losing him before she could make him understand. James felt his chest tighten with anger, betrayal, and terror all at once. Yet beneath it all was a resolve he didn't recognize, a heat that rose with every breath. For the first time in his life he saw the Marin tradition for what it truly was. A cycle built on silence, sacrifice, and obedience fed by fear. Outside the window the estate grounds lay still. The moon spread pale light across the crooked trees that lined the yard. The wind brushed the old shutters as though urging him to move. In that moment James made a decision. He told Leora they would not participate in the binding. They would break the pattern that had trapped generations before them. But escaping the Marin family was not simple. Too many eyes watched the twins. Too many doors locked from the outside. Too many secrets guarded the estate like living things. Still, James felt something shift inside him, something that had been dormant until that night. The truth had been spoken aloud, and the house could no longer silence it. The Marin legacy was beginning to crack. And the first fracture had appeared in the quiet room where two frightened twins vowed to defy a tradition older than themselves. By morning the estate felt different. The hallways seemed narrower, the walls colder, and every sound sharper than usual. It was as if the house had overheard James and Leora's late-night vow and was now preparing to swallow the secret whole. James moved through the corridors with careful steps, aware that the Marin servants rarely spoke but always observed. Their silence was trained, disciplined into them by years of serving under Alistair. They carried trays and tended to rooms without ever meeting the gaze of the twins. Today, however, their eyes lingered a little too long, as though they sensed an unusual tension building beneath the surface of the household. Leora stayed in her room for most of the morning, pretending to be ill. She knew their father would not question her absence. Illness in the days leading up to the binding was expected. It was the body's way of preparing, as the elders often said. In truth, it was fear manifesting in the only physical form the body could muster. James visited her room only briefly, bringing a plate of untouched food as part of the charade. But when he closed the door behind him, he found her pacing, her brow damp with worry. She asked him again if he was certain about defying the family. She needed reassurance, not because she doubted James, but because she feared the consequences that would inevitably follow. James told her he was certain. The certainty hardened inside him like iron. The Marin legacy had consumed enough lives. It would not have theirs. But breaking away required more than intention. It required a plan, and for the first time in 18 years, James realized how little he knew about the outside world. The twins had barely left the estate. The Marins educated their children privately, kept them on the grounds, and shaped their minds before they ever had a chance to develop their own. James had never held money. He had never spoken to someone who wasn't bound to the family in some way. His world began and ended at the estate walls. But fear of the unknown felt lighter than the horror of staying. James spent the afternoon memorizing the estate's lesser-used exits. The grounds were surrounded by dense forest, stretching miles in every direction. Rumors claimed the woods belonged to the family as much as the land itself. Some said the Marins had once buried the remains of failed heirs among the trees. James had never believed the stories fully, but now he found himself thinking of Rowan's journal. The Marins had erased him from their history easily enough. What else had they done to keep their secrets intact? He studied the gates from a distance. They were tall and iron-forged, anchored by thick stone pillars carved with symbols he had never fully understood. The locks were old but well-maintained. No one entered or left without the gatekeeper's knowledge. And the gatekeeper, Mr. Halden, was loyal to the patriarch in a way that bordered on devotion. James knew they would not escape through the main road. The binding ceremony was 2 days away and preparations had begun. Extra guards had been stationed at the outer edges of the property. Torches burned in the evenings to illuminate the walkways used by the elders. There was always movement now, even after sunset. The only path left was the forest. That evening, James and Leora sat together in the small storage room behind the kitchen. It was one of the few places where they could speak freely without fear of being overheard. Leora had brought Rowan's torn journal pages concealed beneath her dress. She opened them carefully, laying the fragile sheets across her lap. They read them together, searching for clues about the binding ritual and any mention of escape. Rowan wrote of the hidden routes within the house, tunnels carved during the estate's earliest construction. These passages had been used during times of war to move between rooms unseen. James had heard whispers about these passages as a child, but Alistair dismissed them as childish tales. Now, with the journal before him, James realized they were real, and one tunnel supposedly led directly to the edge of the forest. Leora traced her finger along Rowan's rough sketch of the layout, her breath catching as she followed the path. The entrance appeared to be behind the oldest bookshelf in the West Wing library. If the sketch was accurate, the passage began beneath the foundation and extended far beyond the visible property line. But the pages were incomplete. Rowan never detailed whether he used the tunnel himself or if he was caught before reaching it. They had no choice but to trust what remained of his notes. That night, James waited until the estate grew quiet. The servants extinguished the lamps one by one. The guards made their rounds. The elders returned to their rooms. When everything settled into the deep silence that came after midnight, James left his room and made his way to Leora's. She was already dressed in a simple cloak, her hands trembling but her eyes steady. Together they moved through the dim corridor, careful not to step on the creaking floorboards they had learned to avoid as children. The West Wing library loomed ahead, its heavy double doors slightly ajar. They slipped inside, closing the doors behind them. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the shelves. The air smelled of dust and old parchment, scents familiar enough to calm their nerves if only briefly. James walked to the bookshelf Rowan had marked. It was the oldest one in the library, its wood warped with age. He ran his fingers along the edges, searching for a loose panel or hidden latch. Leora pressed her ear to the wood, listening as James tapped gently across the surface. When his knuckles struck a hollow patch, both twins froze. James pushed against the panel. At first it resisted. Then, with a quiet groan, the shelf shifted inward. A thin line of cold air escaped from the darkness behind it. The opening was real. Rowan had told the truth. The passage existed. But just as relief washed over them, footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the library. James's pulse spiked. Someone was coming. The footsteps grew louder, firmer, purposeful in their direction. Leora clutched his arm, her breath sharp. They had seconds to decide. James pulled the shelf further open, just enough for them to slip inside. As he guided Leora into the darkness, the library door creaked open behind them. A voice called out into the room, low, authoritative, and unmistakable. It was Alistair Merrin. Alistair Merrin's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Even in its calmest state, it carried the weight of command, the kind that made walls stiffen and air freeze. "James?" he said into the room, though he could not yet see him. "Come out." James held his breath in the dark of the passage, his back pressed against the cool stone. Leora trembled beside him, her fingers digging into his sleeve. The narrow tunnel enclosed them, swallowing what little moonlight the library had left behind. The dust here was ancient, untouched for decades. Every inhale tasted like forgotten years. Through the crack between the panel and the shelf, James could see the outline of his father. Alistair stepped farther into the library, his boots striking the wooden floor in slow, measured beats. He paused at the center of the room as though he could sense the displacement of the shelf. "You have always been quiet," he said softly. "But never invisible." James knew then that his father was not guessing. He had followed them deliberately. He must have noticed their absence, or perhaps he had always suspected that the twins of this generation would eventually rebel. Alistair walked toward the old shelf, his eyes sharpening. He did not look uncertain or curious or confused. Instead he looked disappointed, as if escape were an offense far greater than refusal. He laid a hand on the wood, exactly where James's had been moments earlier. Leora squeezed James's arm, and for a heartbeat he thought she would sob. But she did not. She swallowed the sound, burying it in the same place she had buried years of fear. The shelf creaked again as Alistair pressed his weight against it, testing it. James could hear his own pulse pounding inside his ears. If the panel opened fully, light would spill into the passage and there would be no time to run. The tunnel was narrow, not wide enough to sprint. Their only chance was the darkness, and Alistair's uncertainty. But Alistair did not push the shelf open. Instead, he withdrew his hand. "You are your brother's echo," he murmured. "I should have seen it earlier. Brother. Not twin. Rowan." The word turned to ice inside James. Alistair knew. He had always known. Rowan had not disappeared in sorrow or shame. He had been silenced. The binding had not claimed him. The patriarch had. Alistair's next words confirmed the truth James had been trying not to reach. "Defiance ruins a lineage," he said. "Rowan forgot that. And now you follow his shadow." He turned from the shelf and walked toward the door. "Sleep, James. You have a long ceremony ahead." The library door closed behind him, and his footsteps drifted down the corridor like a slow heartbeat fading into distance. Only when the sound finally died did James push the panel open again. He slipped from the passage into the library, helping Leora follow. She clung to him for balance. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew," James replied. But there was no time to unravel the horror now. They had been given a brief, strange mercy. Their father had not exposed them. Yet his restraint was not born of love. It was confidence. He believed they would not dare try again. He was wrong. The twins returned to their rooms separately, moving through the hallways like ghosts. James lay awake, his mind trapped between Rowan's fate and their own rapidly approaching one. Leora, in her isolated room, did not sleep either. The house creaked under the weight of dawn, and by morning, the estate seemed to watch them more closely than ever. The binding was now one day away. Preparations filled the manor. Servants strung white banners along the corridor leading to the ceremonial hall. Elders arrived from distant towns, their faces severe, their eyes silvered with age and something darker. They bowed to Alistair and inspected the twins with reverent fascination. James endured it in silence. Leora kept her gaze lowered. Neither let their fear show. In the late afternoon, a storm began to gather. Dark clouds rolled in from the eastern ridge, thick and heavy, pressing the air down with humidity and dread. Wind rattled the shutters, and the first drops of rain struck the windows like whispered warnings. It was time. James met Leora in the old storage room once more. Rowan's journal pages lay between them, illuminated by a single flickering lantern. "We cannot wait," Leora said. "No," James agreed. They headed toward the west wing again, but this time they were not cautious. They did not crawl through the shadows. They moved with purpose, their footsteps echoing down the long corridor. If guards or servants saw them, none dared intervene. The twins looked like figures already claimed by destiny. Inside the library, the storm's thunder rolled overhead, shaking the tall windows. James pushed the old shelf aside. The tunnel yawned before them, deep and black. "This is our only path," he whispered. Leora nodded. Together they stepped into the darkness. The air was colder this time, as if the passage itself sensed their desperation. They walked side by side, the lantern held before them. The light revealed stone walls covered in moss, carved with symbols older than the estate. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. The floor sloped downward, then bent sharply in an unknown direction. Minutes stretched into an hour. The tunnel seemed endless. Just as James feared they might be lost, a faint current of air brushed his cheek, fresh, earthy, free. "The forest," Leora whispered. Then, from behind them, another sound answered her. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the stone passage. James turned, lifting the lantern. The light illuminated only a few meters before dissolving into black. But the footsteps continued, closer, steady, unhurried. Alistair had known exactly where they would go. Leora grabbed James's hand. "Run." They plunged forward as the tunnel floor leveled out. The air grew brighter. A small wooden door appeared at the end, half covered by tangled roots. James slammed his shoulder into it. The wood cracked. He struck it again. It burst open. They staggered into the forest, rain washing over them. The storm had swallowed the night, leaving no stars. Trees swayed violently under the wind, their branches clawing at the sky. The door hung crooked behind them, revealing the faint glow of the lantern in the far distance, and the silhouette now approaching it. Alistair stepped into the threshold of the tunnel. He did not raise his voice. He did not chase them. He simply looked out into the storm with the calm of a man who believed the night itself belonged to him. James took Leora's hand and pulled her into the forest. They ran, branches striking their arms, mud swallowing their steps. Behind them, Alistair did not follow. He didn't need to. His presence remained in the trees, in the wind, in the thunder, a force that would not let them go easily. The forest ahead was dark, but deeper darkness followed behind. Their escape had begun. But so had the hunt. Before we end, remember to subscribe and like. More untold histories, buried legacies, and hidden truths await, each one darker than the last.